sector interventions into the fertilizer markets in 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll be looking particularly at national regulatory regimes and what they imply for the supply of fertilizers to smallholder farmers. So 3 countries, and then I'll make 4 points about the regimes that we see in place or that are proposed to be put in place and what that might imply for the degree to which fertilizer is available to smallholder farmers and the access that those farmers would have to that fertilizer. Go ahead. So the study is part of a larger study that was funded by the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa into 3 countries of Uganda, Tanzania, and Mozambique. We were looking just in general terms, what are the factors that are constraining access of smallholder farmers to fertilizer, what is accounting for increased prices at the farm gate. And one of the elements then that we were looking at on the supply side are what are the regulations under which suppliers of fertilizer have to operate in these 3 countries. So at the end of the day, the question that we're asking here is, do these regulations serve to enhance access to high-quality, high-analysis fertilizers to smallholders? And I want to emphasize that I really am focusing here in this brief talk on high-analysis, standard, globally produced fertilizers. Go ahead. I'm sorry, go back 1 to the regulation. Yeah, there we go. Just a brief slide on regulations. Regulations, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you stand on, we generally do tend to agree that in some elements of life, the state does have a role to play in regulating, in this case, markets in particular. We want to ensure that social goods, that social welfare is enhanced insofar as possible, and where markets might act contrary to those social welfare objectives, regulations are seen as a justifiable role for the state to play in markets. And so fertilizer regulations are no different in this regard. There's been a long history of regulations on fertilizer markets globally, pretty much since they started being produced early in the last century. These generally are characterized by truth in labeling approaches, whereby we want to ensure that farmers, when they go to the market, they know what they are purchasing in that fertilizer. They can make a sound decision as to whether that fertilizer will make sense for their productivity objectives and for their profitability goals. Of course, regulations add to cost. They add to the cost of the fertilizer just as they add to the cost of anything else that is being regulated. But generally, the argument made for regulations is that the benefits of the regulation in the aggregate should be outweighing the costs of implementing those regulations. Go ahead. So just quickly on the study countries, all 3 study countries are relatively low adopters of fertilizer, let's say. Uganda is very much a private sector-led approach to providing smallholders with fertilizer. It is growing. We are seeing some substantial growth, but we still are talking about less than 10% of farmers using fertilizer, 40,000 metric tons annual imports. Tanzania, of the 3 countries, is the most engaged in fertilizer promotion. This has a long history going back into the 1970s and is now being re-energized with a very large voucher-based subsidy scheme targeting 2 million smallholders. They're importing 250,000 metric tons of fertilizer. And then finally, Mozambique, of the 3 countries, arguably has the lowest use by smallholders. Most of the fertilizer goes into commercial crops, but there are starting to be some small interventions to produce fertilizer use. So just 3 quick slides on what are the regulations that are in place or proposed to be put in place. Uganda has regulations, laws in place and then regulations to implement those laws. The law that is on the books for Uganda is the Agricultural Chemicals Control Act, and most notably, this treats agrochemicals almost in a blanket fashion. So you're treating pesticides in the same way as you're treating fertilizers. There are regulations developed, and now they're revising those regulations for the implementation of the law. And this includes a full set of registrations. You need to be registered if you're a dealer of fertilizer, if you're an importer of fertilizer. Your premises, if you're dealing in fertilizer, they need to be registered. And all fertilizer products need to be registered, which requires potentially some testing procedures and possibly several years of field trials, although that is not generally done. There is a new set of regulations that are being drafted that will separate pesticides from fertilizers, but these still are not in the books. And actually, when you look at the draft regulations, you still are seeing that fertilizers are really being treated very similar to the way pesticides are treated in those regulations. Go ahead. So Tanzania, there's the Tanzania Fertilizer Act. This is focused, unlike in Uganda, this focuses only on fertilizers. And what's notable there is they seek to establish the Tanzania Fertilizer Regulatory Authority, which will regulate all matters related to fertilizer quality within the country of Tanzania. Through this authority, district-level fertilizer inspectors will be trained within the district government infrastructure. And again, just as in Uganda, there will be these extensive registers of dealers, of products, of premises, and so on. The regulations for the law are still in draft form. They were supposed to receive ministerial assent a couple months ago, but we've not heard whether or not that has taken place. But if the minister gives his assent, then we will find the semi-autonomous agency, the Tanzania Fertilizer Regulatory Authority, in place. And then finally, the Mozambique fertilizer laws and regulations. There are no laws in place currently to regulate fertilizer, but in part because of efforts by AGRA and other international agencies, there is a process now to draft regulations. And these have been, a quite extensive set of draft regulations have been widely circulated for consultations. Just like in Tanzania, these only deal with fertilizer. And these regulations, if you compare them across the three countries, they're probably the lightest in terms of the oversight and policing that is undertaken underneath them. But nonetheless, it still requires the full set of regulations. And you do have it would be a decentralized inspection system put in place under them. So those are the three countries. Go ahead. Now, I'll make 4 critiques of this, and I'm hoping that even though we're looking at the 3 countries, those of you who have nothing to do with any of these 3 countries will still find some lessons to consider or points to ponder when you're thinking about your own country in which you're working, because I think the regulation systems that we're seeing in these 3 countries are probably not that different from it is in your own home country. My first critique is that these regulations are coming from quite scant evidence of adulterated fertilizer. It is all about quality of fertilizer. That's the reason for being for these regulations. But it seems to be that anecdotes are really what is driving these regulations. So when you go and do interviews, as we did as part of these studies, it would seem we'd hear about the same bag of fertilizer that turned out to be sand, or the same bag of fertilizer that was somehow colored to be, it was some lower quality fertilizer that was somehow advertised as a higher quality fertilizer. But it quite quickly became clear that we perceived that we were hearing the same anecdote every time. And when we did our surveys with farmers and traders, very few of the traders and farmers reported that they have had any quality problems in dealing with their suppliers or in making use of the fertilizers that they're provided. As such, there's really no way to separate out a farmer making poor use of the fertilizer that he or she obtains because they don't have the proper information to make good use of that fertilizer from actual fertilizer quality problems. Secondly, on this point, I would highlight that fertilizer is probably not the product. If you are a fraudulent input dealer, fertilizer is probably not the product to use to make a quick return. It's much simpler to adulterate pesticides or to give fake seeds, as we all are aware of, which is a very significant problem. Fertilizer is a generally high bulk, low value product that to make a lot of money by doing fraudulent activities, it just does not make an awful lot of sense. And finally, on this point, we need to recognize that input markets will be self-regulating in terms of quality to some extent. Let's not be naive here. There will always be cheating traders out there. But the fact is that you as a farmer going to a trader who cheated you once, if you go back a second time, then the fault is with you, not necessarily with the trader. So recognize that in a competitive market where there are alternative input suppliers, quality should be of concern to the traders themselves and not just to the consumers. Go ahead. So the second critique is that high analysis fertilizers are standard products. You need to recognize that, and these regulations do not seem to take that into account. They're different from the other agrochemicals. To treat fertilizers and pesticides with the same laws is problematic. Pesticides are potentially dangerous. They are all about killing things. Fertilizer is somewhat different in terms of how it's operating. So there is need for sharp regulation on the agrochemicals, but the properties for high analysis fertilizers in particular, which have been produced now for, I would say here, 75 years, 210 million tons of nutrients were produced globally in 2010. We know their properties. We have a good understanding of what their quality and how they can be used very effectively, and they generally can be used very safely with minimal information. So the regulations that require registration by every importer of one of these high analysis products seems overkill. We know what those products are. There is need to do sampling of those products to ensure that they are meeting the expected standards, but to impose a sharp regulatory burden on this seems to be considerable overkill. Then the third critique of the four is the question of why Ministries of Agriculture should be regulating these fertilizers, the high analysis standard fertilizers. The regulations that are in place in the three countries give very little role to the national product standards and consumer protection agencies, in spite of these goods being very standardized products. It's difficult to see why the Ministries of Agriculture need to lead efforts in fertilizer inspection and standards enforcement. If these standard agencies were able to just take on board fertilizers as part of their regulations, it would open a much broader range of marketing and distribution channels for the fertilizers. Currently, the regulations say they can only be sold by registered dealers. If they are able to be covered under some of these standard agencies, it possibly would allow for a much broader set of commercial entities to manage fertilizers and sell fertilizers to a much broader portion of the population. However, if that takes place, we have to ensure that there are significant investments in information flows to the consumers so that they know what they are using and how they best can make use of it in a profitable way. And finally, the final point, and probably self-evident, there are costs always associated with following these regulations. Many of these will be indirect costs. You know, generally the fees that you have to pay for your registering yourself, your premises, and your products are relatively small. But there are costs in understanding the regulations, there's costs in time, there's opportunity costs. Many people will say, "I'll forget about it, let me go to some other commercial enterprise and I'll leave input supply to others to do." All of these costs pose barriers to market entry, reducing supply, and as we would then imagine, raising the prices that smallholder farmers will face. So the benefits on this sharp, particularly the registration regime for these standard high analysis fertilizers seems to be quite small, both for both consumer protection and for public and environmental health, as well as for some security issues. So finally, the last slide, and just to sum up, from this assessment of the regulations on fertilizer in these three countries, it became very clear to us doing the study that really a pragmatic use should be made of these fertilizer regulations. It doesn't hurt that they're on the books, but they need to be applied in a selective, judicious, and a restrained manner. We need to ensure that the costs of the regulations aren't going to be quickly outweighing the benefits that we seek to obtain. And the best way to do that is for the regulations to be there, for people to be aware of them, but for intensive enforcement only to occur as and when is needed. So let me leave it at that.